So with this talk, I'm going to transition to talk more about the text of Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 26. And again, I hope that you've read that. It's the story of Jesus healing this paralyzed person. And I probably will talk a little bit more about the theological reading for this week. I think that may be a little bit more helpful. The first couple of weeks I've let you kind of work through those on your own, and that's created some difficulties sometimes and some tensions, and I really do appreciate that. I realize you're reading the kind of academic text as it approaches the study of the Bible that is really unfamiliar territory. So one of the things I want to unpack for you first is that the writer of that article, or writers of that article, they mention the triple tradition. Now, the triple tradition, unless you know that code, and I thought they defined it. I reread the article today, and I really don't think they define it all that well. So I mentioned in a previous talk that you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, and that was in a lecture where I was writing on the board and was talking about how the gospels came to be. And then John on the other hand. So you got John on one hand, you got Matthew, Mark, and Luke over here, and these three are called the synoptics. And then John is kind of a unique book on its own, because there's less of the material in John in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke tend to be more similar to each other than they are to John. So when a story or a teaching or whatever of Jesus appears in all three of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, when that happens, that's called a triple tradition. That is, that story or that saying or that teaching appears in all three. Sometimes it's just a double tradition, like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, Matthew 5, Luke 6, and there are some similarities there, but none of that material appears in either Mark or in John. So in Matthew and Luke, there are some similar things said. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit" in Matthew 5, and in Luke 6, "Blessed are the poor." And then goes on and repeats some of the other Beatitudes in Luke 6 as are there in Matthew 5. Well, that's a double tradition. A triple tradition is when a story appears in all three of those synoptic gospels. So that's one thing. I want to look a little bit more closely at one of the passages that is dealt with in the academic reading or in the article for this week, and that's the passage in Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 26, where Jesus heals this paralyzed man. Well, as we kind of go through, let's unpack the players as we have done in the past. So in chapter 5, verse 17, we find that there are Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting around Jesus. Now, it's told us in verse 12, he was in one of the cities. There was a man, a leprous man that came to him, and we're not really told where Jesus is. Well, when we go to Matthew and Mark, we find out that he's in his hometown and he's probably in his own house. And so that's not something that Luke thought was important to tell us, or it was something that maybe Luke wasn't exactly sure that how reliable that tradition was, so he just doesn't include it, doesn't tell us where Jesus is. He just says one day that he was teaching. And you've got these Pharisees. Pharisees, if you remember, they're associated more with the synagogues, not with the temple. The temple is one place. Synagogues, you just have to have 10 males, and adult males, and they can form a synagogue. And these are places where Jewish people go for teaching and for recitation and reading of the law and so forth. Pharisees are a little bit more connected with the synagogues, and the Sadducees and scribes very often are more connected with the temple. Those scribes can kind of go both ways. So you've got the Pharisees, you've got these teachers, and then it's interesting in verse 17 that Luke mentions that they're from Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, every village. And so here we have a case where, like we see a little bit more in the Acts of the Apostles from the writer Luke, he uses geography. He uses geography to make a point. And what he's doing here is creating a context where we see that Jesus has people around him from everywhere in the area of Palestine. They are people that have come together to listen to him teach, and it doesn't necessarily situate him in a house first. That comes a little bit later, but we do know from the text that you've got these Pharisees and teachers. They're the only ones mentioned, and Jesus creates this in a context that that Luke is paying attention to geography, right? So then the Gospel of Luke says something that is not there in Matthew and Mark. It says the power of the Lord was present there to perform healing. So it seems that there's kind of a distancing of the power of the Lord. It's not just Jesus who is doing the healing, it's the power of the Lord is there with him. And this is very much in keeping with the way Luke thinks about Jesus as one who is empowered by the Spirit, and that Jesus' disciples will be people empowered by the Spirit. It's interesting that in the Gospel of Matthew says that, in Jesus' words, what one of you, if your children asks for bread, will you give him a stone? How much more will your heavenly Father, give good gifts to those that ask him? Well, Luke takes that same statement in chapter 11, verse 13, and says, what one of you, your children ask from you bread, will give him a stone. How much more will your Father in heaven give you the Spirit to those that ask? So Luke, I think, is kind of reacting with and digesting Matthew a little bit. I think that's the way it's going. I don't think it's the other way. I think what Luke is doing is saying these good gifts, or maybe it's this saying source that we talked about, Q, right? Luke is saying, whether, kind of conversing with Matthew or that saying source, these gifts that you're talking about, they're further defined as the Spirit. And we see Jesus as one who is operating in the Spirit. So we've got something set up for us where you've got a crowd, you've got Pharisees and teachers of the law, people who are sometimes opponents of Jesus, and you obviously have them mixed in a crowd that will have proponents, so opponents and proponents of Jesus, and you have people from everywhere, and into all of this mix, the power of God is there, and who's going to come on the scene? Well, this paralyzed man is going to come on the scene, and he's going to come on the scene as one who is carried about by his friends. And that's where we'll pick up the story in the next lecture.